Cosmic Skeptic recently put out a new video called How the Bible Supports Slavery. And in the video, not only does he argue that the Bible does support slavery, but it's that bad kind of slavery, like the slavery that we saw during the American slave trade. So I recently did a video talking about the first argument that he made in this video, knowing that I would probably end up having to do a follow-up video if enough people demanded it. A lot of Cosmic Skeptic's fans echoed the same thing that this commenter did when he wrote, "Pretty weak argument. Most of what the Cosmic Skeptic had to say was not even addressed, and I think we all know why." And so I responded, "Yeah, we all know why because I said so in the pinned post, LOL. In the pinned post, I said how I only addressed the first argument and would be making a part 2 or maybe a part 3 if enough people requested it." He writes back, "Why didn't you address what the Bible says about the non-Hebrew slaves and how they are being treated? Hint, you won't like it." So I responded, "LOL. Do you really think that I've never heard any of this before? I'll respond to it in follow-up vids. Hint, you won't like it." So by popular demand, I'll be responding to the remainder of the points in Cosmic Skeptic's video. Now I usually don't do this type of video because I don't typically like when people critique videos by responding to every single thing the person said, because then their bad points get all mixed into the wash. But in this case, because enough people said it, I think I'll go ahead and proceed forth with it. So with that being said, relax and hang tight, because this is going to be a good one. So in case you haven't seen his original video, which is in the description, in his video, he's responding to another video. So this video is a response to his video responding to another video. And it sounds a little awkward worded that way, but anyways, you guys ready to get into it? Word. Then let's go!
Okay, so on to the video.
Hey everyone, my name is Alan Parr. Thank you all so much for visiting my channel. Here on The Beat, we release a new video every single Tuesday, and today we are answering the controversial and many times misunderstood question, does the Bible support slavery? And so what I want to do is I want to give you 7 facts and show you how slavery in the Bible was very different than the slavery that was practiced in our country.
So this should be our first cause for concern. The video begins by suggesting that we're about to hear an argument that the Bible doesn't support slavery, and yet we're now being readied for, instead of "here is proof, unequivocal proof that the Bible condemns slavery," rather something more like, "well, slavery is supported in the Bible, but it's a special kind of slavery that isn't all that bad." Obviously this hasn't been explicitly said yet, but I want you to pay attention to the language being used here. Consider this question throughout the video. Are we being offered proof that the Bible does not justify slavery? Or are we being offered an excuse for the fact that it does?
Alright, so to start, giving context and clarifying terms is not the same thing as making excuses. We'll see what happens throughout the video, but just note that either Cosmic Skeptic is right and Parr is just making excuses. In that case, then Parr is guilty of acting as if there's a relevant distinction between biblical slavery and non-biblical slavery when there really isn't. Or Parr is given relevant distinctions that are significant and also given context, in which case Cosmic Skeptic would actually be guilty of acting as if there are no relevant distinctions when in actuality there are. So who is the guilty offender here? We'll see.
Number 1, God did not create slavery, but rather he regulated it.
Okay, would it be cheap of me to point out that Christians believe themselves to be in absolute subjection to the divine, and so yes, God literally did invent slavery, himself being the first and eternal slaver of mankind? Perhaps, but it's an important point. God did in fact invent the concept of the ownership of human beings, since he himself has an absolute right and authority over our lives.
Okay, stop right there. Now right off the bat, we have a pretty bad argument. So first off, willful submission is not the same thing as slavery. This seems pretty obvious. I willfully submit to my wife and I willfully entered into marriage with her, but that doesn't mean that I'm a slave. Now I've already responded to this argument in the previous video, but let me just add another quick thought here. So let's be clear on his argument here. He states that God is a slave owner because he has a right and authority over mankind. But if you have children like I do, you also have a right and authority over them, but that doesn't mean that you're a slave owner just because you created them. I mean, but okay, I'll play ball. So let's just go ahead and grant that. If you have a right and authority over people, then that makes you a slave owner. But just as my kids can grow up and move out and they can choose to separate from my love, my guidance, and my protection, we can also choose to separate ourselves from God's love, guidance, and protection. That's actually what hell is according to the Bible. And it doesn't even matter what view you hold on hell. All of the views that I know all agree that hell is separation from God. So even on his argument, a person can still choose to separate from God if they wish.
This is, of course, not the kind of slavery being discussed in the video, but if anything, this even more undeniable type of slavery propagated in the Bible is even worse than the kind apparent in the slave trade. At least when owned by a human being, there's always a chance of redemption, changes in the law, escaping to freedom, or at the very least death, if it's decided that no life is better than one spent in bondage. This is all possible in something like the slave trade. Not so much with the ownership of human beings by God. There is no escape. There is no chance of a change in the law. There is no appeal, and there is no death. Now, I can already hear you. Alex, don't be such a melodramatic Hitchens impersonator. God isn't a slave owner. Slave owners don't offer their slaves a chance to access paradise, and they certainly don't give them a choice. They chain them up and whip them into forced labor. God gives his subjects a choice. They're able to follow him or not, as they please. We have to be incredibly careful to unpack the euphemistic language of religion, to understand what the real message is behind any teaching. So, what kind of choice is it exactly that God offers if the consequences of this choice are as severe as the Bible reports? Remember, the choice isn't just follow me or reject me as you please. It's follow me or reject me and be sent to suffer in an unimaginable series of torture for eternity.
Okay, so now we've moved on from Christians being slaves because they willfully choose to submit to God, but now we're talking about all of humanity being slaves because they don't have a choice. So to be clear, his argument seems to be that being forced to choose between God and hell is really no choice at all. So this doesn't just make Christians slaves, but it makes all of humanity slaves. Now, what's wrong with this argument? To be clear, just because God doesn't offer as an alternative choice that Cosmic Skeptic would prefer, doesn't mean that we don't have any choices at all. That doesn't mean that God hasn't given us a choice. It means that God's only given us a choice between two alternatives. I mean, let's consider the logic being used here. So we all have to follow the speed limit. Now, if we choose to speed anyway and we get caught, then we have to suffer the consequences for the choice that we made. So we have two options here. We can either do what the lawmakers say and obey the law, or we can choose not to and then suffer the consequences for that choice. Does that mean because I don't like either of these two choices that the speed limit laws are slavery? Is Jesse Smollett innocent? Nope. So if the speed limit laws don't make us slaves, then only having two choices that we don't like do not make us slaves either.
Now imagine the slaver in the slave trade again. His slave is on his knees in front of the slaver, and the slaver offers him an ultimatum. This is your last chance, he says. I'm going to give you a choice. You continue to work the fields for me without pay, or I'll lock you and your family up and whip you 100 times. But it's your choice. Follow me or reject me, and don't forget to be grateful that I'm being so merciful as to offer you the choice. Clearly, this is a grotesque form of slavery, and there is no choice. And in fact, imprisonment and 100 lashes is nowhere near as bad as the torments of hell. All this is to say, God is no stranger to the concept of human slavery.
But to make matters even worse, if there could be such a thing, Cosmic Skeptic does not seem to understand the basic understanding of the gospel in Christianity, and it's not as grim as he tries to make it out to be. In Christianity, here's the real choice. God is giving you two options, one of which is God himself paying for all of the things that you yourself have done wrong, or you can choose to pay the consequences for all the things that you yourself have done wrong yourself. So God's actually offering to pay your debt. So if we relate this back to the slave owner analogy, what do we get? On one hand, we have a slave that's much more like a prisoner in today's society. We have somebody that did a lot of things wrong and he has to pay the consequences for those things that he did wrong. And on the other hand, we have the slave owner who says, hey, let me pay for the things that you did wrong so that way you don't have to pay for them yourself and I'll take on the suffering so that way you don't have to suffer. That's the analogy that's more accurate when we're talking about Christianity.
Number one, God did not create slavery, but rather he regulated it.
So here's the spot where we have to stop and define some terms real quick so that way we can understand what's meant by the word slave for the remainder of the video. What is the slave? According to our modern dictionary, a slave is a person who's the legal property of another person and is forced to obey them. Now it's pretty obvious what we think of when we hear the word slave today. We all have a mental picture of what we learned growing up in school. As a black man who has ancestors that were kidnapped and brought to America, forced into abusive labor, I can emotionally relate to the connotation that this word has for us today. This is obviously something that I don't take lightweight. So when we think of the word slave, we're usually thinking of people being held against their will and treated as things instead of people. By things, I mean objects that don't have the rights of people, and the owner can do whatever they wish to their things. So in other words, what makes the word slavery so offensive today is that it carries the emotional connotation of people being degraded and oppressed and treated like things instead of people. In our culture, when we hear the word slave, we immediately think of the American slave trade. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew word that's being translated to slave is abed, which comes from the root word abad, which means to work or to serve. So the word abed directly translates to the words worker or servant. There is no Hebrew word for slave. The word abed was a neutral word that denotes a relationship based on dependency. So the word was neutral, it wasn't inherently negative, which is why we see the word used in positive ways and also used as a word of honor. But as anybody who's actually really looked deep into this subject realizes that things just aren't as cut and dry as we would like for them to be. In the Old Testament times, we could say that there were about 3 main categories that slaves or servants would fall under. The first, and by far the most common, are servants who are voluntarily working to pay off debt or to acquire land. These are the Hebrew servants or slaves. The next categories are foreigners who are non-Hebrew, but who also voluntarily entered into work for the same reasons. They wanted to pay off debt or acquire land as well, and we'll get into more of the context about this later on. And then there's the third category of servants or slaves. This is the category where we can just call them the bad guys for now. In this category is where you're going to find those like the prisoner of wars who were captured from other armies. Obviously, things were going to be a little bit different for these people because they were more of a threat. They'd be working harder and they'd be under a tighter watch, but these guys weren't slaves, they were prisoners. The Hebrew words and the context help us to discern what category of these servants or slaves we're talking about, and also how God instructed for them to be treated during biblical times. The slaves that are mentioned in the main verses that Cosmic Skeptic talking about are best understood as workers or servants. They weren't the bad guys. Although he does talk about the bad guys later on towards the end of his video. But overall, the people that he's talking about were working to pay off debt, to acquire land, or looking for a new place to live. So it wasn't like the slave trade in America. Now, I'm not trying to romanticize this type of slavery. I'm not trying to say that it was always easy or anything like that. But one thing that needs to be clear is that it was voluntary. Now, I know that Cosmic Skeptic objects to this, so we're going to go ahead and visit his objections here in a little bit in the video.
God did not create slavery, but rather he regulated it. And so just like there were laws about murder and theft and polygamy and divorce, God knew that the hearts of people were evil, and so he had to establish laws that would regulate slavery.
Okay, stop. Yes, the Bible contains laws regulating murder, theft, polygamy, and divorce. But here's an important question. What are these regulations exactly? Well, let's see. The regulations on murder are don't do it. The regulations on theft are don't do it. Polygamy, divorce, yeah, don't do it. The laws regulating these things were not regulations, but explicit condemnations. Exodus 20:15, for instance, reads, "Thou shalt not steal." This leaves no room for confusion, and I wouldn't dream of arguing that the Bible endorses theft. I'll repeat, the only appropriate regulation on slavery is its abolition. Anything less than this at the very least demonstrates that God doesn't feel as strongly about it as he does, say, divorce or adultery. "Thou shalt not claim ownership of other human beings" is nowhere to be found in the pronouncements at Sinai or in any of the books that follow it. Why not?
Okay, so Par here, the other guy that was in the video, was a little sloppy and seemingly implying that all of the things that are regulated are in the same category. But Cosmic Skeptic's basic question still holds. The basic question here seems to be, why did God flat out command things like don't kill, don't steal? But when it comes to slavery, instead of flat out commanding against slavery, he punched regulations around it. Well, the first thing that came to my mind when I considered Cosmic Skeptic's question was that he's still holding on to this faulty assumption as if it wasn't consensual and there was no benefit for both parties involved. It seems that if he did, then that would explain why it was different than murder and theft. The only person that feels like they got some sort of benefit from murder and theft is the person that's doing the killing or the stealing. What Cosmic Skeptic still seems to have in mind is involuntary forced labor. And as we'll see in a little bit, it was voluntary and there were mutual benefits for both parties. And that's why it makes a lot more sense to regulate it instead of flat out abolishing it.
He had to establish laws that would regulate slavery and ensure the proper treatment of slaves.
Ensure the proper treatment of slaves. Again, I'll press this. The only proper treatment of slaves is their emancipation, and nothing that falls short of this. There were no laws making sure that the victims of theft were properly treated. People were simply told not to do it. Proper treatment of slaves is a contradiction in terms.
Okay, just as we discussed before, the only reason that he sees a contradiction between slavery and the proper treatment of slaves is because he's still presupposing a view of slavery that was like the slavery that we found during the American slave trade. But he hasn't demonstrated this assumption yet, he's only assumed it. But as we'll see later, he actually concedes that there is some truth to the fact that some slavery was voluntary, but we'll get to that later. But if I can, may I throw in a little bit of a side note here? Cosmic Skeptic is a moral subjectivist. He made a video a while back about how morality is just an opinion, and he also had a debate on this with my friend Michael from Inspiring Philosophy. In the debate, Cosmic Skeptic argues that there isn't anything that's objectively right and wrong. By the way, objective here means morality that's true for everyone and morality that everyone is bounded to. So when he seems to insist that there's only one proper treatment of slaves and that everybody ought to follow it, even God apparently, then he's instantly discredited his own views inside of his own worldview. And this is no minor slip up either. This is a huge problem when he claims that there's only one proper way to treat slaves inside of his worldview, where all views and all ways to treat slaves are inherently equal.
And so the very fact that there is a law about it at all indicates that God did not approve of it, and it wasn't his perfect will, because God did not establish laws to regulate or limit good, only to regulate evil.
This is quite embarrassingly ridiculous. We know God didn't approve of slavery because he made laws regulating it. Think about that for a minute. During the time of slavery in the USA, there were many laws regulating the slave trade regarding movement, punishment, education, and other treatment of slaves. Does this in any way justify the practice or indicate that the US at the time was actually anti-slavery just because they had regulations? Of course not. Also, let's not pretend like God doesn't regulate all sorts of things that he approves of as well, like worship and marriage and sex and other things which show that God regulating a certain practice doesn't indicate that he opposes it, just that he wants it to be performed in a certain way. Again, what is indicative of him opposing something is an explicit condemnation of it, which he doesn't provide for slavery, only regulations. And again, the only appropriate regulation for slavery is its abolition.
Okay, here I actually agree with the general point that Cosmic Skeptic is making. If Parr wanted to justify his point, then he would have needed to establish more steps to get to his conclusion. I'm not saying that Parr is wrong here per se, but in order for Parr to make his case, he needs to have more points showing when regulating means disapproval.
Further, notice the flip-flopping here. Earlier, like we discussed, this guy was saying that slavery in the Bible isn't what it was in the USA. It isn't like the slave trade. The word meant a different thing back then. And this indicated that the Bible does condone slavery, but that that's okay because slavery didn't mean what it does today. But now we're hearing from this guy how the Bible apparently doesn't condone slavery, implying that biblical slavery was the bad kind of slavery as we do know it today. In other words, we're first being hit by slavery is condoned, but it meant something different back then. But when this fails, when someone points out that actually this was the evil kind of slavery, the narrative is completely switched up, and it's instead argued that slavery isn't condoned. This is indicative of that characteristically religious style of arguing that's more concerned with defending its conclusion and saving face than it is with actually analysing the ideas in question. The apologist will quickly change up their argument and subtly contradict their previous thoughts if it means that they can avoid admitting that they might be mistaken, or worse, God forbid, that the Bible might be mistaken.
Okay, stop. My goodness. Stop. So here Cosmic Skeptic criticizes Parr for initially arguing that the slavery in the Bible is not the same slavery that was in the West, and then Parr switches his argument to say that God isn't cool with slavery either. But did you catch that? Did you see what happened? If you notice, Cosmic Skeptic starts off by recapping Parr's argument, but then he inserts something into his recap that had nothing to do with Parr's argument. Cosmic Skeptic reframed Parr's argument, and then he said,
when this fails, when someone points out that actually this was the evil kind of slavery, the narrative is completely switched up.
Now, I agree that Parr did switch up his argument, but what Cosmic Skeptic is implying of him isn't true at all of what Parr did. There is no one pointing out this kind of slavery which caused Parr to change his position. Cosmic Skeptic just inserted some fictional character into his recap, and then he went on to say, see, this is what theists do when you press them. In Parr's video, Parr did switch gears for his own reasons, but those reasons were not in reaction to some non-theist interlocutor. It's not as though Parr were responding to Cosmic Skeptic or anyone else putting pressure on him. So, Cosmic Skeptic, that was smooth, and I'm sure it worked on some, but it wasn't smooth enough, homeboy. Now, I do hope you realize that there are a lot of parts of the video, so make sure that you're in the playlist. I have that link down in the description, and so that way you can catch all of it, because all of these are going to tie together in some way. So you have to watch them all. So if you're not already in the playlist, go ahead and click right here. I'll see you guys over at the next video. And, oh yeah. What do you mean?